talking a lot. As a matter of fact, this whole time we've been in the prophecies of the Old Testament concerning the Messiah, the coming King. We talked last time about the Psalms. The book of Psalms is really the hymnal of the Jewish church. It's what they would have sang in a congregation. They had many of these songs committed to memory. I want you to keep that in mind for this particular devotional on Advent. There's something that's familiar, I think, to everybody who's maybe even just taken a cursory look at the Gospels. There's something that Jesus says while on the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I want you to consider for a moment the context of that. Here's Jesus, proclaimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He called himself God. He said that he was the great I am. He was spectacular in his life, his righteousness, his wisdom, his ability to answer the objections and questions of those who were attacking him. He knew the future before it happened. He could walk on water and control the creation itself. He could give sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, and he can give the lame their legs back. He could raise people from the dead. And of course, we know that he raised himself from the dead. He said, "You destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." Jesus is spectacular. He's amazing. He is God in the flesh. He is the King. And on the cross, Jesus is not merely God, he is also man. He's the God-man. But on that cross, he was bleeding. He was beaten. He was tortured. He had a crown of thorns smashed into his head. He was whipped with a cat o' nine tails. He is suffocating on that cross, because on the cross, you of course had blood loss, but you also had the problem of suffocation. You were basically being pulled down, and you had to push up to gasp for air. And of course, the pain was excruciating, which means out of the cross kind of pain. And you had to have this all day long up and down process of pain in the wrists and in the ankles, and you had to push up to gasp for air. That was all taking place, and people were witnessing this. They were seeing all of this occur. And yet, on the cross, Jesus is surrounded by Jewish people who knew their Bibles. They knew the Psalms. Again, they sang these while they were in congregation. And Jesus says very few things, actually, on the way to the cross and on the cross. But on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What I often do when I talk about this particular passage in the Psalms, Psalm 22, is I do it like this. I want you to try something with me. I want you to finish this song. Amazing grace that saved I once was lost, was blind, but now see, you knew it, right? Because if you're a Christian, you've been raised in church, or even in any kind of Christian community in the West, you've heard that song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. But notice how you were able to finish my song because you know the lyrics. Well, what's interesting is the Jewish people surrounding the cross on that terrible day, that amazing day, they hear Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And what's incredible about that moment is they should have finished the song like you just did with Amazing Grace, because they know their Bibles, they know Psalm 22. And in Psalm 22, it says, the very first verse, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a psalm that was written so long before Jesus came and was crucified and rose again from the dead. And he says, "Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame." And then it says, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads, saying, 'He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him.'" Isn't that incredible? That's what took place at the cross that terrible day. When Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If the Jewish people who knew their hymnal, if they knew these psalms, if they had started finishing the song that Jesus started, they would have been singing literally about what they were doing in that very moment. They would have made the connection. This psalm we've been singing is about this moment. It's about this Messiah. It's about this King. And it goes on. "Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." One of the consequences of crucifixion was just that problem, your bones coming out of joint. "My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast." You all know the story. On the cross, one of the ways they could get you to die faster is to suffocate you quickly by breaking your legs. If they broke your legs, you wouldn't be able to push up any longer to gasp for air. You really died from crucifixion, primarily from suffocation. So we know the story. They didn't want those men hanging on those crosses at that time of year. And so they had Roman soldiers go to the criminals next to Jesus to break their legs so they would die quickly, to break their bones. And then they come to Jesus and see that he's already dead, so they don't break his bones, which, by the way, goes back to the promise, of course, of the lamb and Passover. You were not to break the bones of the lamb, and it needed to be a lamb with no spot or blemish. That's Jesus. But they go to Jesus and they don't break his bones. But what they did do, we know, is they took a spear and they shoved it through his side, and it says that blood and water flowed out. Many medical doctors have talked about the fact that this probably is an example of what we know would take place if you pierce somebody's heart sac. You would see exactly that in the wound, pouring out blood and water. And the text actually in the Psalms says, not only are his bones out of joint, but his heart is like wax, it is melted within him. "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death." This Messiah is going to die. And remember, of course, while Jesus is on the cross, Jesus said, "I thirst." It says, "For dogs encompass me, and a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. My God, why have you forsaken me?" That was the song they were singing. Jesus starts the song off for them. If they would have started singing with him, they would have been singing about what was taking place right in front of them, down to dividing his garments among them, and for his clothing casting lots. That's exactly what took place at the foot of the cross. Now, of course, this is glorious. When we talk about Advent and the coming of God as a man, God becoming king, we talk about prophecies like this written 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, before he comes, that portray his passion in such vivid detail. They should have known what they were doing. They were singing about it long before it happened. What's often missed, however, is just the story of what this glorious king is going to accomplish. Because yes, this song starts off with the passion of Christ. It tells the story in detail about piercing his hands and his feet, long before that form of torture is even in anybody's mind. But the rest of the psalm, listen to it. It says, verse 22, "After laying in the dust of death, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him." So we go from being laid in the dust of death to this messianic figure telling of his name, God's name, to his brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. He goes from death to telling his brothers about God. And then it says, verse 27, "All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to Yahweh, and he rules over the nations." We've been talking a lot about let earth receive her king, because that's the story. summed up. Christ is the King. God became King. And kingship belongs to God. Not only do we see the passion of the Messiah and Him dying, laid in the dust of death, and all the details of that work on that terrible day at the cross, you then see that all the families of the earth will return to worship Yahweh. That's the story. The Messiah is not just going to die and rise again. He is going to be seated on His throne. He's going to be the King, and He's going to draw the nations of the earth to God. All the families of the earth are going to return to worship Yahweh. And the glorious thing about the Christian faith is you see exactly that. It started like a mustard seed, very small. You can barely see it in the palm of your hand. And then it grows and grows and grows into a tree larger than a man. That is the story of the Messiah. He's the King. He's going to draw the nations to God, Jew and Gentile, black and white and yellow and brown and red. All the nations, every tribe, tongue, people, and nation are going to come and return to God, to worship God because of this crucified Messiah. He was going to die, but not just die, rise again from the dead, and then as King, draw the nations to God. That is worth celebrating. It's worth more than a season of celebration. It's worth a life of celebration and trust in Christ because He's the King. And He's drawing the nations to God as we speak. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ today, you're a fulfillment of Psalm 22 and God's promises. They are sure. So let earth receive her King. Merry Christmas, everybody.